Cuckoo for Politics is available on most popular podcast platforms, such as Apple, Spotify, and the Cuckoo for Politics YouTube channel. Hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss an episode. Past episodes can be found on the website, cuckooforpolitics.com. I will add links to those platforms and to my social media accounts, like on Facebook and Instagram, in the show notes below. Feel free to comment on either of those platforms, as I welcome all feedback. Appreciate your support. Take care. This is Michael, host of the political podcast, Cuckoo for Politics. I am so passionate about politics, hence the name Cuckoo for Politics, and I hope you are too. Thanks for joining. This is a podcast discussion on political perspectives on various issues that matter with citizens of the world. So I do ask that you grab your favorite libations, whether it be coffee, tea, water, juice, beer, wine, or a spirit or two, and let's get ready for some lively conversation and let's learn something together. In the previous episode, Shift Change Part 2, at the negotiating table, I sat down with Ken Diaz. He is the Master Executive Council President for United Airlines and the Chief Negotiator, representing union members. Ken shared firsthand what unfolded during the long years and months of the negotiating cycle between the union and management. He shed some light on the key players, the proposals exchange, and how work rules, pay, and benefits stack up against the other flight attendant work groups, mainly at American and at Delta. We explored the broader economic landscape, the shifting political climate, and how the pressures from various industries, like in healthcare, have influenced the often tense discussion at the bargaining table. It was a wide-ranging conversation, offering a deeper look into the particulars that matter to union members who ultimately must vote to accept or reject the terms of the tentative agreement. Now, as members cast their votes, the final outcome won't be known for some time. Meanwhile, the leadership, including all the local presidents who have endorsed this tentative agreement, are urging members to vote yes. My question to Ken is, why? Why do we need to vote yes? Now, for those who have been following the series, thank you so much for your support and continue listening. If this is your first time to the podcast, welcome. Let me just give you a quick bio of my guest. Ken has been a steadfast advocate for workers' rights since the beginning of his airline career in 1983. He started first at People's Express, later moving on to Continental, Carnival, and now United. His commitment extends beyond the negotiating table. He has lobbied Congress for mandatory security training for flight attendants after the September 11th attacks. He has stood on the picket lines alongside his members, pushing for meaningful improvements in their working conditions. Ken is also a returning guest on this podcast. You may check past episodes on your favorite podcast platforms or go to the cuckooforpolitics.com website. Feel free to subscribe if you haven't already and hit the like button so you won't miss future episodes. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Cuckoo for Politics. Let's get ready for a lively and insightful discussion while learning something together. What's up, good people? Michael here. Welcome back to another episode of Cuckoo for Politics. Ken, thank you for taking the time to come back. There's so much that we covered in the first episode. And now I'm glad you are able to come back and discuss other issues that have come up. So let me take off your president negotiating hat. Take that off and remember you're one of us now, a flight attendant. Given the situation that has taken place, you're a veteran working for the airline. You've went through 2009-11, you went through bankruptcy, then you went through the merger, and then you went through the pandemic, and you are now present day. You know, as from all that time frame, what the benefits that you had and that had to be lost through the bankruptcy. You knew the salaries and so forth. The quality of life was different. Again, we're talking about the early 2000s. It is now 2025. Given all the concessions, if you want to say, or the modifications that you feel like you were had to, Now, this is the time you see record profits. You see the CEO getting an egregious amount of money. You also see the airline investing in technology, new equipment, uniforms. You see them settling with other labor groups. This is your time. You're like, this is it. We are going to get our fair share finally. And then you see a proposal and you're like, wait, is that the rate that they're proposing? Are you feeling, wouldn't you sense like anger? Like, what is your feeling if you, not the negotiator, not the union leader, but the rank and file, and like, this is our time? And then you see what was presented by the union leadership. What would be your first reaction?
So it's difficult to answer that question, Michael, because having been in negotiations, I also understand what's entailed in negotiating a flight attendant contract. So as a flight attendant, I know from a business perspective, United Airlines is not going to have a flight attendant contract that is 30% more expensive than their competitors or 50% more expensive than their competitors. That just doesn't happen because they negotiate not only for the good times, but we've all been through the cycles and there'll be more cycles. They also negotiate for the bad times. And the example I can give is, in 2021, even though we're getting 4% retro pay on 2021, as a flight attendant, I know we would have never gotten a 4% raise in 2021 because the company lost $2 billion that year. So, I mean,
During the
I look at
pandemic.
during the pandemic. So I look at all the aspects as a flight attendant. Is this contract, this TA, worth me voting yes? Now, am I angry? Of course I'm angry because not for nothing. I actually believe we do have the best flight attendants in the industry. Okay. Do I believe what they've done to us over the decades? When I get my PBGC check every month, because I collect it now, $133 of a pension that was stolen from me. Okay. I can't undo that. So yes, there's lingering anger over what every single CEO has done to us over the years. So the anger as a flight attendant is real. The anger of a flight attendant when you're looking back at the decades is real. But as a flight attendant, I also understand we work under a completely different industry today than existed 20 years ago. Okay. You now have three carriers that are mega carriers. Okay. There is no touching Delta, United, and American, even though American's not doing as good financially as Delta and United. But they're untouchable now. They control over 80% of the market. Okay. That wasn't the case 20 years ago. Okay. The low cost carriers had made inroads into the market share. Right now, the low cost model doesn't work in today's industry. So, I mean, I have to, as a flight attendant, have to take all of those issues into when I make an informed decision. Now, yes, do I have other information from being a negotiator for so many years and being at the table during this? Yeah, I do have more information than the line flight attendant. But as a flight attendant who will be working 4 years under this contract, I have to vote yes because I know there has never been $6 billion improvements in any flight attendant contract in the history of the airline industry, ever. I know how much more our TA is worth compared to American. I know what we have that Delta doesn't have because they're not unionized. We don't pay 26% for our medical, and it's a medical plan that is not as good as ours because I look in our contract and in our TA, it's not only that we kept the cost sharing the same because healthcare has gone up in this country. Okay. So as a flight attendant, I have to say we have Cadillac medical care. We work so closely with ALPA on our medical plans. We use the same outside company to advise us. There is no medical plan for flight attendants in the industry that is good as ours. So for me, as a flight attendant that is aging, I need good medical medical for me and my family. So it's protected in this TA. That's one reason that I'm leaning towards the yes. I know that we have the best work rules. Work rules cost money, okay? I know that we protected every work rule that I'm voting on in this TA. So that's another reason why I'm voting yes. I know that we definitely as a group said no to PBS as far as line building, okay? That's 100 million years in savings for Delta, 100 years millions in savings for American, and not the savings for United. So yes. And so I put that as a win. So another reason I am voting yes. I'm voting yes because let me even talk about, was I pissed off that we only got a 1% increase into our 401k? You're damn right, as a flight attendant, I was pissed off. Okay. Is it still the highest in the industry? Yes, there are some, American has the same, but is someone higher than us? No. And people will tell me, oh, yeah, but Southwest has 9.3%. No, Southwest has 9.3% match. Not all our flight attendants, especially not at the top of the wage scale, can put 9.3% in their early years of flying into their 401k. So they're not getting 9.3% at Southwest because they have no direct. But let me give you figures, and I want to quote them because I've written them down, because you can't just weigh the 1% increase. So I want to give factual information, okay? So I'm just going to use an example. So if someone flew, and I'm using 100 hours because I know everyone doesn't fly 100 hours, but it was easier to do the math. If 100 hours you were flying today, every month, United puts a 5% direct contribution and a 3% match. So United today in dollars puts $6,443 into that flight attendant's retirement for the ones that get the 5 and 3. I will talk about the pre-merger Continental also. Under this TA, the 1% increase, as long as you put 4% in of your earnings, which I think most people can afford, okay? And when you do in our wage rates, now I'm only taking the wage rate. I'm not even taking the boarding pay, because the boarding pay on average adds 7.5% to your wage rate. Actually, for domestic flight attendants, that's actually in the high teens of a percentage increase to your wage rate. So I'm not even counting that money, because that's extra money that goes into your 401k. But if it was just based on the wage rates in this TA, based on the same 100 hours, United has to put $9,156 cash into your 401k. That is 42% more than they are putting in today for the same amount of hours flying. So now let's talk about those that came from pre-merger Cal. They get the same dollar value increase of the 1% into their 401k, but they have different percentages because they have a CARP pension plan. Now, I'm not sure if you know that we use an outside firm, the same as Alpha. It's called Cryon. All they do is medical plans and retirement plans. We had to make sure, because everyone has a different retirement here. If you were pre-merger Cal, if you were pre-merger United, and then of course everyone that was hired after that is in the current 5.3 and in the TA 5.4 with the match. So we had to make sure that the money that United puts in to everyone's retirement is the same, so it keeps the same value of contributions, considering that Cal has a pension. Now, there are Cal flight attendants that are saying, why aren't they getting the 5 and the 4? Well, you're not, because you're getting a pension and we're not. So that was what we got to make up for what we lost for our pension, okay? So when you take all the different, and you can see it in the contract, all the different levels that Cal has of less money, but they're getting the same value total into the retirement. So everybody is equal, whether you have a pension or not. of what United contributes. Okay. And having been through that dreadful part of pre-merger United losing our pensions, it was a gut punch to all of us during bankruptcy. Okay. Especially after all that we gave up to try to keep them running.
It still resonates.
But I will tell you how my opinion has changed. Today, I am glad that I control my retirement because I can't trust these corporations what they do with our money. So, I've been very successful in how I've invested. I've gotten the financial advisors. I've used the services that don't cost you through Fidelity. I've met with financial advisors many times, and I have made up so much of what I lost from my pension by having that expert advice, giving me how to do my investments and everything without United ever having the chance to mess up my retirement. Other people might not feel that way, but I just know that from the returns that I have gotten on my 401k since we started the 401ks. So I want to rest assured that even though it's 1%, realize that even for pre-merger Cal, it's 42% more money on any amount of hours that you fly that they're going to be putting cash into your retirement 401k under this TA than they are currently putting under our contract, even though it's 1%. And yes, I hear about the pilots. Why are they so much higher? Realize the pilots have a mandatory retirement age. We don't, okay? We get to decide when we retire. So we can still keep building our retirement funds. They can't. They have to retire at a mandatory age. So you're comparing apples to oranges.
Yeah, they're the only work group that has a mandatory retirement, unlike mechanics, customer service agents, and so forth.
Yes, and that's why they have a very different input into the formula into their 401k.
So, what do you say to a group that was there ever a time that the corporation reached out to the union and said, okay, we understand that we lost during bankruptcy, we took away your pension. Now, either pre-merger or post-merger, we're going to offer you a different, what's the word? I just went blank. A different pension. Are they going to offer you something like that? And the union said, no, we're not interested in negotiating a new pension. No. Was there ever a time that
they have never come to us offering a new pension? Actually, no CEO since we lost our pensions has ever talked about what we lost. Okay, they feel that that's past tense. Move on. I mean, they have never offered us a pension ever.
Yeah, and I think there has been thought pattern that with a new administration, meaning new airline management team, that they would offer it. But to be clear, no, they never offered. Once it was lost, it was
never. And don't forget, Michael, at the time, the laws were different, too, what happened to us. I mean, thank God that Congress passed more laws protecting pensions and the restoration. I mean, my brother is a Teamster who didn't lose their pension, but it was decreased by 75%. Okay. The Biden administration passed that law that protected pensions, and they got their full restoration for what they lost to their pension. Glad for them, but that law didn't exist for us, and we can't go back retroactively under the law that was passed that protects people's pensions today.
So that's I'm glad you clarified that, because people have discussed that, like, why can't we get a retirement? But the whole country has changed, the whole mindset, the corporation has changed. And when you said it was a different time, there were different airlines. There were America West, there was US Airways, there were others. And now you just mentioned it's just the big giants are just Delta, American, and United. And yes, they're still small. That's it. That's it. Yeah. I mean, yes, you do have the JetBlues, you do have Frontier, but if we're comparing the size of us,
JetBlue is not doing well financially, so that's a whole nother story. Well, that model of all the other carriers, because actually JetBlue offers a good service if you fly on their aircraft. Okay, I've flown on them, and actually, I'm pleasantly surprised by its good service. The model of all those airlines isn't the same that worked in the past in today's environment. So that's why those airlines of smaller size are having such difficulty making profits.
Now, so let's go look into certain work rules, as you mentioned. There's an improvement because it's hard to, as I open up this our conversation, if you were going through that time period, there's a feeling that you want to correct everything that has been wrong to you for those years. And now you want to have an understanding. The business model has changed. The political climate has changed. Management has changed. So we have to work with present day and no longer rely on to the past. So let's look into work schedules. To the outside world, it's different. A flight attendant, including the pilots, anyone who works in the airline industry, it's not 9 to 5. It's a 24/7, 365-day job. There are times that we are working 10 hours, 14 hours a day. And those are long hours. Again, not 9 to 5. However, there's a component that we're not getting paid. So my guest Ken described, you said boarding pay. That was unheard of in the industry until other airlines started putting that for their workforce. Some, I would say, but Delta was the first non-union airline for the flight attendant work group to get it. And I think that's really from the pressure of the threat of the flight attendant work group unionizing, particularly by the Association of Flight Attendants. And they waved that carrot to them to try to persuade them not to sign for a union. But it's a policy that could be taken away at any given time with any management team. So we're now seeing other airline work groups, particularly in the flight attendant group, getting boarding pay. That's going to be a new component for us because we never had that. If you fly domestically, there's many more legs. So there's a potential increase for more boarding pay added to your already hourly rate. On a international, there is, but not so much.
Can I comment on something you just said?
Yeah.
We've run some current pairings that reserves get, because let's face it, reserves get the leftover and usually the uglier domestic trips that are left over. Okay. And when we've run in some of these pairings, because don't forget, there are some pairings that have 3 and 4 boardings per day. So there are certain pairings that actually the percentage to the wage increase is hitting 20% because of the amount of boardings that they do in the month. So I'm very confident that domestic, those that fly domestic, because of the number of boardings, they're well over the 7.5%. Why it's coming to 7.5% is you hit it correctly, Michael. On an international flying, you're doing a boarding, you're doing a flight, you're going to layover, and you're doing 1 boarding home. So you're doing 2 boardings in a pairing. I mean, there are some domestic pairings that you could be doing 6 and 8 boardings in just 1 pairing. So yes, there is a difference. And that's why we say it's an average increase to your hourly wage rate. But it'll be much more for reserves that are actually getting kind of ugly pairings domestically.
Yeah, it has very ugly pairings. So this comes to mind, though. As you recall, on a domestic leg, you could go, and I'll just give for those who are not, just to give a picture, you could leave from Newark, Washington, Dulles, if you want to say, either on the East Coast. You're working a flight from those destinations, let's say Newark. You're going to Chicago, you sit, then you continue on to Denver, you sit and a sit means you're waiting for your next flight. So you can sit at the airport 2 to 3 hours. And if there's a weather delay, forget it, that goes on beyond. And then you're working a leg and another flight from Denver to Los Angeles with a layover in Los Angeles. But given that scenario, Ken, you sit for 3 hours in Chicago, you sit for another 1 hour or 2 hours in Denver, and then you will finally get to your destination, which is Los Angeles. During that time frame, again, there are times when that individual, the flight attendant, is not being paid. Why were we not able to get ground pay, which will also compensate the crew members during that time?
So a couple of reasons. So don't forget when we first proposed ground pay, we told everyone it would be breaking a barrier that doesn't exist. There is no airline, and let me repeat, there is no airline that has what is called ground pay. What certain airlines have is a sit rig, which is totally different. So let me explain that. So the reason pilots mostly have the sit rig after 2 hours is when the industry started going to ground pay for flight attendants, obviously pilots can't get, boarding pay. Pilots can't get boarding pay because they don't board aircraft. Okay. So they were able to get sit rigs after 2 hours. Most of your flight attendant groups that got sit rigs, it's sit rigs after 2 hours. So let me explain what that is. 2.5 hours, I'm saying. So I'll use American as an example. They have a sit rig after 2.5 hours, 1 for 2. So let me give an example. If you have a 3.5 hour sit, okay, their sit rig doesn't kick in until 2.5 hours. Okay. But wait. So now you have an hour there. Wait, they have boarding pay. So take boarding pay out of that. So that sit rig is kicking in 1 for 2 for like 20 minutes on some flights when you take the boarding part out of it. So you're getting the sit rig for the 20 minutes. So although it is a way to prevent sits, let's not think it's this huge amount that these people are getting on sit rigs. That's why we propose ground pay, because you're right. This industry from its inception has never paid flight attendants other than when you're actually working a flight. Not boarding, not deplaning, nothing, okay? We introduced it knowing it would be groundbreaking. We've opened the whole discussion. And I actually believe, since it was in our opening proposal, that is why Delta would never agree to a ground pay and why they went to boarding pay. And then boarding pay became the norm. Now, from the corporation's perspective, and this just isn't United, they believe since the inception of our careers, they always believed that our hourly rate of pay would never have been as high as it was at any point in our career because they believe it encompassed all the time you spent at an airline. Okay? That's their mentality, not ours. That's theirs. Okay? And what we have to keep fighting to change an archaic mindset is you can get disciplined on time you're not being paid for. Yes, you have a rig in there as far as your duty day, but it's really unpaid time. You're responsible to the company, for, all this discipline that happens on whether it be a layover or a sit or something like that, all of what we consider unpaid time. So at the end of the day, why we weren't able to get the sit rig, and I can explain why we didn't, because we fought sit rig to the actual last day of negotiation. The sit rig, while we're not allowed to give the actual cost because some of these cost numbers are not out to the competitors, I want to explain, United does fly differently than our two main competitors. United does what is called bank flying. And you know what that is. They have morning bank. They might have a midday bank, a mid-afternoon bank, an evening bank. The other airlines are flying constantly through the day without bank flying. Bank flying in itself creates sits. Now, you mentioned some sits. There's actually worse sits. So you take the smaller bases like Cleveland or the Florida satellites and everything. They actually, United has gotten around it because you're checking in before 7 p.m. You're going like on your trip. Okay, when you get to the West Coast, they have you checking in before 7 p.m. Okay, and then you're doing a flight or maybe two. Then you have a long sit before you do a red eye. Okay, so even though the pairing is legal, what we have said across the table, a pairing could be legal and still be inhumane. So we thought that we wanted that end of the flying changed, where we thought that was even more dangerous, because don't forget, when a flight attendant gets home and some get in a car to go, can you imagine how that flight attendant is feeling after working with such a long sit before a red eye? And why we weren't successful in getting it is, I can tell you, without giving you the number, it does cost in the hundreds of millions for a 5-year contract. And by that time, we had already reached the $6 billion. So it would have had to come from somewhere, okay? And the only two places we had that could take that much out would have been the wage rate or the retro. So can you imagine if we came with a wage rate which wasn't the highest? Or could you imagine we came with the retro, which was an industry leaning? So that was one of the tense moments in our caucus room, because we were so torn, because we know it's such a problem, the sits. But think about it. Had we been successful in the sit rig, they would have changed the optimizer. They probably would have had 3-hour sits, because when you put in the boarding time, they wouldn't have had to pay for the sit rig. So nobody would have gotten any money. And we thought it was more important to put the money in your actual wage rate for block hours and in your retro to be the industry leading formula in retro, where you were actually getting the dollars, where even though we were going to be charged the hundreds of million for the sit rig, you wouldn't have seen it because they would have changed the optimizer. So you wouldn't have seen the value that we were being charged. So that was one of the hardest decisions we had to make at the end, because at the end, listen, Scott Kirby came in here thinking he hates his competitor, American. He actually thought he was going to be the CEO of American, okay? And that was his goal at American, okay? And when they chose somebody else, obviously he left and he came to United as the CEO. So there's a grudge there, okay? Let me just put that, okay? And when he saw that American, and he always on purpose deliberately waited till these contracts were settled, because he wanted to know what all these airlines were paying, so he can make his mind up what he was coming into and telling his team to spend. So I know for a fact, knowing Scott and knowing how he's operated at all the airlines that he's worked with, and Joe having worked at all those airlines under a Scott Kirby, we knew that he came in not wanting to spend 1 cent more than American did in improvements, okay? So American got $4.2 billion in improvements for the 5 years, okay? And that's what he brought his team in. And we kind of noticed it, because when we were seeing costing, and they were like, first of all, a couple of things, we caught them costing too high. Thank God our actuary and opening all the books up, we proved wrong. So we got the model down, and our costing was almost pretty exact on both sides. So we beat them at that game that they were trying to play. But we kind of noticed when they were so hesitant about, that the complaints are about these sit times from all the flight attendants, in-flight's hearing about it. I mean, we actually had a really good conversation with local presidents who see it on a daily basis, that were on the negotiating committee, speaking to them, and blank stares. And I can tell you, some senior management that is not in the positions that I want to see them in when our current leader of in-flight leaves imminently, they get it, and they saw it. And they saw the blank faces on scheduling. They saw the blank faces on the finance team, because in-flight knows it. They're hearing it from flight attendants. So although we were not able to get that, because it was that hard money decision at the end, and that was the hardest for us internally, because that is cruel. What we're telling flight attendants now is, use those fatigue reports. That is the only thing that is going to change some of those pairings. Use those fatigue reports. And yes, we have gotten changes to some pairings from fatigue reports. But I mean, did I want a sit rig in this contract? Of course I did. Every single one of us did. We were furious that we couldn't get it. But he directed. that once he got to 6 billion, he was furious at his own team because he's the one that made this decision to break down negotiations 3 times in that last week, and we had to have pushing them that we would ridicule them that they walked away from negotiations because we were determined that we were going to keep going at them, stretching that money. But once we stretched it 1.8 billion more than Americans spent, we couldn't move them anymore. And we had an obligation to then present you with the TA because the NMB didn't give us any more dates yet. And I didn't know when the next dates were going to be because they have so many airlines in mediation and they only have a certain amount of mediators. So I definitely know they told us they weren't going to give us 2 weeks a month like we currently had. But, we would have had to wait because their schedules are already booked for the summer. So I didn't know when we're getting the next dates. Just like I don't know when would get the next dates should this TA not ratify. That's a whole process in itself that you have to go through. So, that's the bottom line, Michael. What happened at the end? Am I disappointed? Of course I'm disappointed as a flight attendant, okay? But I do understand why we didn't get it.
So you clarified some things too, because it's not like the union did not know about these assignments with the long duty days, especially on sits and in working a red eye. And yes, the fatigue reports, I guess from my side, I'm thinking, I write all these reports and there's no changes. I'm being frustrated. And then I'm not even being compensated for these long times. But I guess just like how the airline pattern bargains to see what the other airlines are doing, we as a union group are doing the same thing. Or seeing if other airline work groups get this, then we should be able to achieve this. And we may not get to full extent, but we're getting something to hopefully improve upon in the next contract cycle. And it's frustrating too, because the domestic side, again, international has their own, that's a whole different paradigm too, but the domestic side, which is the bulk of our operation, it's torturous. and it's like the idea of not being fairly compensated. And by the time you get to your layover, you're exhausted, or by the time you return home, you're extremely exhausted.
Michael, I'll share something that I said because we had such heated conversations over the table on these sit times. And they didn't like when I said it, but I really meant it. Are they waiting for a tragedy to happen when somebody gets home and is driving home? Is that what it's going to take to open their eyes to what's happening with some of these pairings? And they didn't like that I said that on the record, but I meant that. Is that what it's going to take? A tragedy for them to do something about it? And that's why Kate, when I hear about this, we care. Are you really caring of how that flight attendant? And I'm going to give you another example. During that last week, okay, we had 15-hour sessions every single day, 9 o'clock in the morning, 12, and actually some of them went to 2:30 in the morning, okay? When we finally hit the 15-hour mark, okay, and we were calling it a day, and I'm seeing all the yawns on the management side. Yeah, I did something that maybe it's never been done in a formal negotiation, but I had to do it. I stood up and I said, emergency, medical help. Are you ready to help? And they looked at me like with a strange face. And I said, you just reached the time that our flight attendants work on a regular basis, and they have to be ready for emergency. And I don't think any of you on that side of the table would have been ready right now. And I walked out of the room.
Yeah, they don't understand that concept. I'm glad you did that because I recall working all night. I landed from San Francisco. I was in JFK, well, just in New York in general. Driving home, I got pulled over by the police, and the police saw me in uniform. He says, were you drinking? I'm like, no. He says, I said, I just came in from work and I'm just driving. I'm just tired. I'm trying to get home. He escorted me to my exit. He says, you were driving like you were drunk. That's why I had to pull you over. I didn't realize that I was going from lane to lane. I just was on automatic because of the long sit time. And then you're driving, and I was like, I said, boy, I can't do that again. I'm going to have to pull over. You need proper rest. And I don't think the airline sees it as a spreadsheet looking at units. As long as we get this plane going to point A to B and C, they're not looking at the human toll it takes when they build that schedule up. And I'm glad you did that example in there, because after long negotiations, you're in one time zone. You're in one place. And then you're supposed to be a first responder?
Michael, I'm going to share with you a personal experience. Back in the 80s, when I started flying, I was a 2-year flight attendant at a non-union carrier, okay, that used to work us hours and hours and hours, okay? And at that time, my family's home was down on Long Beach Island. So I had a long drive from Newark Airport when I got home from one of these red-eye flying flights, okay? I actually crashed on the New Jersey Turnpike, went into the northbound lane and was hit, okay? And was taken in an ambulance from there. My car was totally demolished. How I lived, I have no idea. And I was a young kid that time. I had just started in this industry. And that was because it made me afterwards realize, like, why to get into a union carrier to have rules. But I mean, and that's what I'm saying. Is this airline waiting for a tragedy to happen to open their eyes to what's maybe legal, but totally inhumane? I mean, and I don't want to ever see that happen, but God forbid that it does. Okay. I will call them the bastards that they are. I mean that sincerely. I mean, some of these pairings are inhumane flying. Okay. They could never do it. They could never do it that they're asking flight attendants to do, and be alert to deal with every emergency that may come on.
And to the wider audience, there are trips or schedules where the flight attendants will work from Honolulu, which is a red eye, land in Los Angeles or San Francisco, somewhere in the West Coast, sit for a while for that 2 to 3 hours, or less, depending, and then continue on to the East Coast and be a first responder. I mean, this is one of the frustrations. I like, no, we can't do this anymore. It's impossible. And those individuals that do it it doesn't matter what age, you're just human. Ken, let's talk more about other schedule issuing too in another segment of Cuckoo for Politics. Here is my take on this particular episode. Why say yes? Clearly, collective bargaining is the process by which the union negotiates on behalf of its members to improve critical areas like pay, benefits, work-life policies, job security, and other priorities shaped by the membership. It's not an easy task. The rank and file bring a whole range of priorities to the table, shaped by their age, years of service, and lived experiences on the job. The union's responsibility is balancing the voices of over 28,000 of its members who are at different stages of their careers, while also anticipating the needs of future workers. After proposals are exchanged and the debates are held, often under a high-tension environment, an agreement is eventually reached, item by item through good faith negotiations. But there are still unresolved questions, as the outcome of this agreement has not been known at the time of this recording. So my question is, did the union get it right? Did the 99% strike authorization vote provided the leverage the negotiators needed to push the envelope? Did the company engage in good faith, addressing the realities of flight attendant work lives while protecting its bottom line? Or did the temperament of a profit-driven CEO overshadow the reasonableness of investing in the very workers responsible for the company's success? It's clear neither side got everything they wanted. At times, my guest described needing to be overly dramatic just so the company representatives understand the daily struggles faced by crew members, especially during long duty days and on red-eye flights. Coming out of the pandemic, the airline business model shifted. Companies are placing more responsibilities on crew members, often without sufficient staffing to support those additional demands. Meanwhile, corporate America is also reevaluating its role in providing retiree and employer subsidized healthcare, adding further complexity to these negotiations. These conversations aren't happening in a vacuum. They're unfolding in a broader landscape where expectations, economic pressures, and the very structure of work are changing rapidly. Now, as members are voting on this tentative agreement, the ultimate test will be the final outcome. Now, if the majority votes yes, it signals that the union met the needs and priorities of most of its members. But if the majority votes no, then the message is clear. The union missed the mark on what the membership expected. It'll be forced to return to the table, not to start from scratch per se, but to reevaluate its strategy and better align with the workforce that's constantly evolving. Now, there's more to come from Ken in our next conversation called The Shift Change Part 3, Read the Fine Print, where I unpack contract language, those so-called gray areas that often seem to benefit the company than the rank and file. There's also another special episode, The Debrief, a one-on-one with the negotiator himself, Ken, which will be released at the conclusion of the Shift Change series. All episodes can be found on the podcast platform you're listening or watching, or on the cuckooforpolitics.com website. If you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the like button so you don't miss future episodes. This is Michael, host of the political podcast, Cuckoo for Politics. Thank you for listening. Until the next episode, stay blessed.